In the sprawling countryside of England, where ancient manor houses hold secrets darker than their shadowed corridors, the Ashworth family legacy was about to unravel in ways no one could have imagined. When Lord Edmund Ashworth died suddenly, at 73, his family expected a simple reading of the will. What they discovered instead would shatter everything they believed about their patriarch, their fortune, and the woman who had vanished without a trace 20 years ago. Sometimes the dead don't stay buried, and sometimes the living wish they had never been found. The rain hammered against the tall windows of Ashworth Manor like angry fists demanding entry. Inside the grand library, 4 people sat in uncomfortable silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the massive stone fireplace. The air was thick with tension and the musty smell of old books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Charles Ashworth shifted nervously in his leather chair, his designer suit wrinkled from the long journey from London. At 45, he had inherited his father's sharp features but none of his commanding presence. His fingers drummed impatiently on the mahogany table as he glanced repeatedly at his expensive watch. The reading of his father's will should have been a formality, a quick distribution of assets that would secure his future. Instead, they had been waiting for over an hour. Across from him sat his younger brother, Marcus, whose casual attire of jeans and a worn sweater marked him as the family's black sheep. At 38, Marcus had spent most of his adult life traveling the world, much to their father's disappointment. His weathered hands bore the scars of various adventures, and his sun-darkened skin told stories of years spent far from the English countryside. Unlike Charles, Marcus seemed oddly calm, almost amused by the delay. Between them sat their stepmother, Victoria Ashworth, a woman of 50 whose beauty had been carefully maintained through years of expensive treatments and procedures. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against her wineglass as she took another sip of the vintage Bordeaux she had helped herself to from Lord Edmund's private collection. Ashworth, I'm afraid there are aspects of your late husband's affairs that may come as a surprise to all of you. Marcus leaned forward, his interest finally piqued. What kind of surprises, Harold? Before the solicitor could answer, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the manor, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. What in bloody hell was that? The library doors burst open, and Mrs. Henley, the longtime housekeeper, stumbled into the room. Her gray hair had come loose from its usual neat bun, and her face was flushed with exertion and fear. Mr. Charles, sir, she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. You need to come quickly. We've found something in the East Wing. Found what? Victoria demanded, rising from her chair. Mrs. Henley's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Charles. It's the vault, sir. The one behind Lord Edmund's study. The earthquake last month must have shifted something because the wall has cracked open, and we can see inside. The room fell silent except for the continued drumming of rain against the windows. Lord Edmund's private study had always been off limits to everyone except the man himself. Even his children, Charles and Marcus, had never been allowed inside, and it had remained locked since their father's death. A vault? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Father never mentioned any vault. Mrs. Henley wrung her hands nervously. That's not all, sir. There's someone inside. The wineglass slipped from Victoria's fingers, shattering against the stone floor. The sound seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room, and, suddenly, everyone was talking at once. Someone inside? Charles's voice was sharp with disbelief. What do you mean, someone inside? Alive or dead? Marcus asked grimly. Mrs. Henley shook her head rapidly. Not alive, sir. It appears to be remains. But there's more. There are papers scattered everywhere, and what looks like a desk and chair. It's like someone was living there. Mr. Pembridge had gone completely white, and his papers fluttered to the floor as his hands shook uncontrollably. Oh dear, he whispered. Oh dear, oh dear. Victoria grabbed the solicitor's arm. Harold, what do you know about this? I can't, this isn't how it was supposed to happen, he stammered. Charles strode across the room and gripped the older man's shoulders. Harold, if you know something about what's in that vault, you need to tell us right now. The solicitor looked around the room desperately, as if seeking an escape route. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. The instructions, he whispered. Your father's final instructions were to open the vault after his death, but only if it hadn't been discovered naturally. He said the truth needed to come out, one way or another. What truth? Marcus demanded. Mr. Pembridge reached for his briefcase with shaking hands and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. This was to be read only after the vault was opened. Your father made me swear an oath. The solicitor's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal and unfolded several sheets of heavy paper. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and his face grew even paler. Dear God, he breathed. Read it, Charles commanded. Mr. Pembridge cleared his throat nervously and began to read in a voice barely above a whisper. To my sons Charles and Marcus, and to my wife Victoria, I confess that my death may not be the end of my secrets, but rather the beginning of their revelation. For 20 years, I have carried a burden that has poisoned every day of my existence. Behind the wall of my study lies the truth about what happened to Evelyn Blackwood, the woman the world believes simply vanished without a trace. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Even she, who had only known Edmund for the last 5 years, knew the story of Evelyn Blackwood. It had been one of England's most famous missing person cases. The beautiful socialite and heiress had disappeared from a charity gala at a London hotel 20 years ago, leaving behind no trace except her abandoned purse and a single high-heeled shoe found in the hotel's garden. Mr. Pembridge continued reading, his voice growing stronger as the full magnitude of the confession became clear. Evelyn discovered something about our family's business dealings that would have destroyed us all. She threatened to expose certain financial irregularities that would have not only ruined the Ashworth name but sent several people to prison. I met with her that night at the hotel, intending to negotiate, to find some way to convince her to stay silent. But she was determined to go to the authorities. The solicitor paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill in the room. What happened next was not planned, was not intended, but it changed everything. During our argument, Evelyn fell and struck her head against the stone balustrade in the hotel garden. I checked for a pulse, for any sign of life, but she was gone. In my panic, I made a decision that has haunted me every day since. I brought her body here, to Ashworth Manor, and sealed it in the vault that my grandfather had constructed during the war years. Charles sank into his chair, his face ashen. Marcus stood frozen by the fireplace, staring into the flames. Victoria had begun to pace the room, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. There's more, Mr. Pembridge said quietly. For 20 years, I have lived with this secret, watching as Evelyn's family searched for answers, as the police investigation grew cold, as the media moved on to other stories. I told myself that revealing the truth would serve no purpose, that it would only cause more pain. But I was wrong. The truth has its own weight, its own power, and it demands to be known. The solicitor looked up from the papers. The letter goes on to provide specific details about the location of the vault and instructions for its proper opening. Mrs. Henley, who had been standing quietly by the door, spoke up again. Sirs, there's something else. When we found the opening in the wall, we could see that there are more papers inside. Stacks of them. And what looks like photographs. Marcus finally broke his silence. We have to go down there. We have to see what else Father left behind. Victoria shook her head vigorously. Are you mad? We need to call the police immediately. This is a crime scene. Not yet, Charles said, his voice strangely calm. Not until we know everything. If Father left other documents, other evidence, we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we involve the authorities. Mr. Pembridge folded the letter carefully. I must advise against that course of action. Tampering with evidence, Harold, Marcus interrupted, you've kept this secret for 20 years. A few more hours won't make any difference. The solicitor looked around the room helplessly. Your father specifically instructed that once the vault was opened, everything inside should be examined before any authorities were contacted. He said there were aspects of this case that went beyond just Evelyn's death. Thunder crashed outside, and the lights flickered momentarily. In that brief moment of darkness, each person in the room felt the weight of the decision they were about to make. "Show us," Charles said finally. Mrs. Henley nodded and led them out of the library, through the long corridors lined with portraits of previous generations of Ashworths. Their footsteps echoed hollowly on the marble floors as they made their way toward the east wing of the manor. The study that had been Lord Edmund's private sanctuary was a smaller, more intimate room than the grand library. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and tall bookcases held first editions and family papers dating back centuries. Behind the massive oak desk, where a landscape painting had once hung, a jagged crack now split the wall from floor to ceiling. Through the opening, they could see into a small chamber that had been completely hidden from view. Emergency lighting that Mrs. Henley had brought revealed the outline of what appeared to be a makeshift office. A desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets were visible in the shadows. And, in one corner, covered by what had once been an expensive silk dress, lay the unmistakable form of human remains. Charles was the first to step through the opening, followed reluctantly by the others. The air inside the vault was stale and carried the faint smell of old papers and something else that made Victoria cover her nose with her handkerchief. The desk was covered with documents, many of them yellowed with age. Photographs were scattered across the surface, some face down, others revealing images of people and places that none of them immediately recognized. Marcus picked up one of the photographs and held it to the light. It showed a young woman with dark hair and striking features standing next to a man they all recognized as a much younger version of their father. "Evelyn Blackwood," he said quietly. Charles examined the documents on the desk. Bank statements, legal papers, and what appeared to be correspondence between their father and several other individuals. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grim. "My God," he whispered. "This wasn't just about hiding her body. Father was involved in something much bigger." Victoria had remained near the entrance, unwilling to venture deeper into the vault. "What do you mean?" Charles held up a series of bank statements. "These show transfers of millions of pounds to offshore accounts. And look at this correspondence. Father wasn't just conducting illegal business dealings, he was part of a network that involved some of the most powerful families in England." Mr. Pembridge had found another envelope marked with today's date. Inside was a second letter from Lord Edmund, shorter than the first but no less shocking in its implications. "If you are reading this," the solicitor read aloud, "then you have discovered not just my darkest secret, but the evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of British society. Evelyn Blackwood didn't stumble upon our financial irregularities by accident. She was investigating us deliberately, working with someone who had provided her with inside information. Her death set in motion a series of events that I have spent 20 years trying to control, but which I now realize may have been orchestrated from the beginning." The letter continued to detail how Lord Edmund had gradually uncovered evidence that Evelyn's investigation was part of a larger scheme involving corporate espionage, political manipulation, and financial fraud on a massive scale. "The people who sent Evelyn to investigate us never intended for her to leave that hotel alive," the letter concluded. "I may have been the instrument of her death, but I was never the architect of her fate. The real masterminds of this conspiracy have spent the past 20 years consolidating their power, and my silence has made me complicit in their crimes." As the full scope of their father's confession became clear, the 4 people standing in the hidden vault began to understand that they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple murder case. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and, somewhere in the darkness, other forces were already beginning to move. The opening of Lord Edmund's vault had not gone unnoticed, and there were people who had spent decades ensuring that its secrets would never see the light of day. The discovery in the vault was just the beginning. The real story of Evelyn Blackwood's death, and the conspiracy that surrounded it, was about to unfold in ways that none of them could have imagined. As Charles gathered the most important documents and photographs, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Many of the papers were copies, and several bore recent dates, some as recent as the week before their father's death. Someone else had been in this vault. Recently. And they had been preparing for exactly this moment. The grandfather clock in the main hall of Ashworth Manor struck midnight as Charles spread the documents across the library table under the harsh glare of additional lamps they had brought in. The storm outside had intensified, and the wind howled through the ancient trees surrounding the estate like the voices of long-dead secrets demanding to be heard. Marcus stood by the fireplace, studying a photograph that had shaken them all to their core. It showed their father at what appeared to be a private dinner party, seated at an elegant table with 5 other men. 3 of the faces were immediately recognizable to anyone who followed British politics and business: Sir Reginald Thornby, the media mogul, Lord Geoffrey Pemberton, a senior member of Parliament, and James Crawford, one of London's most influential bankers. "I remember this dinner," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension that filled the room. "Father hosted it here about 3 months before Evelyn disappeared. He told us it was just a business meeting, but he was unusually secretive about it." Victoria had finally composed herself enough to examine some of the documents, though her hands still trembled as she turned each page. "These bank records show regular payments from all of these men's companies into a single account. Millions of pounds over several years." Mr. Pembridge had found his reading glasses and was carefully examining what appeared to be meeting minutes typed on official letterhead. According to these notes, they called themselves the Heritage Foundation. Ostensibly a charitable organization focused on preserving British cultural institutions, but the real purpose seems to have been quite different. Charles looked up from a folder labeled Security Protocols that contained surveillance reports and background checks on dozens of individuals. They weren't just moving money around for tax purposes. "Look at this list of targets." The list was chilling in its scope and detail. Politicians who had voted against certain legislation, journalists who had written unfavorable articles about Foundation members' businesses, activists who had opposed their development projects, and business competitors who had interfered with their interests. Next to each name were detailed personal profiles, including family information, financial vulnerabilities, and what appeared to be planned responses to neutralize their opposition. Evelyn Blackwood's name was near the top of the list, with extensive notes about her investigation into offshore banking irregularities. But what made Charles's stomach turn was the notation next to her name: Permanent Solution Authorized EA responsible for execution. "EA," Marcus said, reading over his brother's shoulder. "Edmund Ashworth. Father wasn't just covering up an accidental death. He was assigned to kill her." Victoria dropped the papers she was holding and sank into a chair. "This can't be real. Edmund was many things, but he wasn't a murderer." "According to this," Charles said, his voice grim as he continued reading from Evelyn's file, "she had discovered that the Heritage Foundation was laundering money for several international criminal organizations. She wasn't just investigating tax evasion, she had uncovered evidence of connections to arms dealers, human traffickers, and worse." Mr. Pembridge had grown increasingly pale as he read through more of the documents. "There's a detailed timeline here of her investigation. She'd been gathering evidence for over a year, working with someone inside one of the member organizations who was feeding her information." "Who?" Marcus demanded. The solicitor's hands shook as he found the relevant document. "The code name used in these papers is Mockingbird. But there's a note here that suggests the identity was discovered shortly before Evelyn's death." Charles found another folder, this one containing what appeared to be surveillance photographs and reports. The images showed Evelyn meeting with various individuals in London restaurants, parks, and office buildings. The final photographs in the series showed her entering the hotel where she would disappear forever. But it was the last photograph that stopped Charles cold. It showed Evelyn in the hotel garden, but she wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows behind her was a figure that was clearly recognizable, even in the dim lighting. "Father wasn't the only one there that night," he said quietly, showing the photograph to the others. The second figure in the photograph was Sir Reginald Thornby, the media magnate. And, according to the timestamp on the photo, it was taken less than an hour before Evelyn's disappearance. Marcus grabbed the photograph and studied it intently. If Thornby was there, and if Father was supposed to handle Evelyn's permanent solution, then what really happened that night? Their answer came in the form of another letter, this one written in their father's handwriting, but clearly composed at a different time than his formal confession. The paper was older, the ink faded, and the writing showed signs of stress and haste. Victoria read it aloud, her voice growing stronger as the full scope of the deception became clear. They set me up from the beginning. I thought I was meeting Evelyn to negotiate, to find some way to contain the damage her investigation might cause. But, when I arrived at the hotel, she was already dead. Thornby was standing over her body, and he told me that she had suffered an unfortunate accident. He said that since I was the designated point of contact for her case, it was my responsibility to dispose of the evidence. The letter continued to detail how Thornby had convinced Edmund that reporting Evelyn's death would implicate all of them in the crimes she had been investigating. He painted a picture of inevitable scandal, prison sentences, and the destruction of their families' reputations. Thornby provided the van, the tools, everything needed to move her body. He said the Heritage Foundation would protect me as long as I kept silent about what really happened. But, I realize now that I wasn't being protected, I was being controlled. Charles found himself thinking about his father's behavior over the past 20 years. The increasing isolation, the suspicious nature, the way he had gradually distanced himself from old friends and business associates. It wasn't guilt that had driven him, it was fear. Father wasn't a killer, Marcus said, reaching the same conclusion. He was a patsy. They needed someone to take responsibility for Evelyn's death, someone they could control completely. Mrs. Henley, who had been quietly organizing the documents they had brought from the vault, suddenly looked up with a startled expression. "Mr. Charles, there's something else you need to see." She handed him a small leather journal that had been tucked inside one of the filing cabinet drawers. The journal contained entries dating from just a few months ago, written in their father's increasingly shaky handwriting. The entries revealed that Lord Edmund had finally decided to expose the truth about the Heritage Foundation, but he had discovered that doing so would be far more dangerous than he had initially realized. March 15th, they know I'm planning to talk. Someone broke into the study last night. Nothing was taken, but they wanted me to know they could reach me anytime. March 22nd, received a photograph of Charles leaving his office in London. The message was clear. If I talk, my family will pay the price. April 3rd, Victoria's car was tampered with. The mechanic said it was designed to look like an accident, but the brake lines were deliberately severed. They're escalating. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Lord Edmund's death, April 10th. I know I don't have much time left. They've made their intentions clear. But I've been preparing for this moment for months. Everything they need to know is in the vault, along with evidence they'll never be able to suppress. My death will trigger protocols I've put in place. The truth will come out, one way or another. Victoria looked up from the journal with tears in her eyes. He knew he was going to die. He was trying to protect us. But Charles had found something else that made him question everything they thought they understood about their father's death. Hidden in the back of the journal was a business card for a private investigator named Sarah Mitchell, with a note written in Edmund's handwriting: "Insurance policy activated upon my death." He hired someone, Charles realized. Someone who's supposed to contact us if anything happened to him. As if summoned by his words, the telephone in the library began to ring. The sound cut through the storm-filled night like a blade, and all four of them stared at the device as if it were a dangerous animal. Charles finally answered on the 5th ring. "Mr. Ashworth?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and distinctly female. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I believe you've been expecting my call." Charles motioned for the others to gather around as he activated the speaker function. "Ms. Mitchell, yes. We found your card in my father's journal. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Ashworth, but we don't have much time for condolences. Your father hired me 6 months ago to conduct a parallel investigation into the Heritage Foundation and Evelyn Blackwood's disappearance. He suspected that his phone lines were monitored, so we established a protocol that would trigger my contact with you only after his death." Marcus leaned toward the phone. "What kind of investigation?" "The kind that's kept me awake for the past 6 months and nearly gotten me killed twice," Sarah replied grimly. "Your father was right to be paranoid. The Heritage Foundation isn't just a British organization, it's part of a much larger international network. And they've been cleaning up loose ends very aggressively since your father started asking questions. Victoria gripped Charles's arm. What do you mean, cleaning up loose ends? 3 people who had peripheral knowledge of Evelyn Blackwood's investigation have died in the past year. All of them in ways that appeared to be accidents or natural causes. Your father was supposed to be the 4th. The room fell silent except for the sound of the storm raging outside. Finally, Charles found his voice. What do you need from us? I need you to get out of that house immediately. My surveillance indicates that you're not alone on the property tonight. There are at least 3 vehicles positioned around the manor, and they've been there since about an hour after you discovered the vault. Charles looked toward the windows, but the heavy curtains blocked any view of the grounds. How do you know this? Because I'm watching them from the woods on the north side of your property. Your father hired me to protect his family as well as investigate the truth. Right now, protection is the priority. Mr. Pembridge spoke up for the first time during the phone conversation. Ms. Mitchell, this is Harold Pembridge, the family solicitor. What exactly are you suggesting we do? I'm suggesting that you gather the most important documents you found and leave immediately. I have a secure location where we can examine the evidence properly and plan our next moves. But if you stay in that house much longer, you'll never get the chance to use what you've discovered. As if to emphasize her point, the lights in the manor suddenly went out, plunging them into complete darkness except for the glow from the fireplace. That's not the storm, Sarah's voice came through the phone speaker with urgent clarity. They've cut your power lines. You have maybe 5 minutes before they move in. Charles felt his way to the desk drawer where he remembered seeing a flashlight during their earlier search. His hands closed around the cold metal just as they heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere deeper in the house. They're inside, he whispered. Emergency exit through the kitchen, Sarah instructed. There's a service road that runs behind the property. I'll meet you where it intersects with the main road in 10 minutes. Victoria was already gathering the most crucial documents they had identified, stuffing them into a leather satchel that had belonged to Edmund. Marcus grabbed the photographs and the journal, while Mr. Pembridge clutched his briefcase containing the original will and confession letters. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors of the manor, moving steadily closer to the library. Charles could see the beam of flashlight sweeping across the walls through the crack under the door. Move, he whispered urgently. They made their way through the darkened house using their knowledge of its layout, carefully avoiding the main corridors where they could hear the intruders searching room by room. Mrs. Henley led them through a maze of service passages that she had navigated for over 30 years. As they reached the kitchen, they could hear voices behind them, growing closer with each passing second. Split up, Charles whispered. Marcus, take Victoria and Mr. Pembridge through the back garden. Mrs. Henley and I will go through the greenhouse. We'll meet at the service road. But, as they opened the kitchen door, they found themselves facing a figure in dark clothing holding a silenced pistol. The man's face was obscured by a ski mask, but his posture radiated professional menace. I don't think so, he said quietly. Before anyone could react, Mrs. Henley stepped forward with surprising speed and threw a pot of scalding water from the stove directly into the intruder's face. His scream of pain and surprise echoed through the kitchen as he stumbled backward, giving them the opening they needed. Charles grabbed Victoria's hand and ran for the garden door while Marcus helped Mr. Pembridge navigate the kitchen obstacles. Mrs. Henley, moving with the agility of someone half her age, led them through the greenhouse and toward the service road. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of more breaking glass as the intruders realized their targets had escaped. Flashlight beams swept across the gardens as armed figures poured out of the manor in pursuit. The service road seemed impossibly far away as they stumbled through the darkness, guided only by their knowledge of the property and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated their path. Victoria's high heels made running difficult, and Mr. Pembridge was gasping for breath within minutes. Just as Charles began to wonder if they would make it to safety, they saw the headlights of a vehicle waiting exactly where Sarah had promised. The car's engine was running, and a woman with short dark hair and alert eyes was scanning the road in both directions. Get in, she called as they approached. All of you, quickly. As they piled into the vehicle, Charles looked back toward the manor and saw multiple flashlight beams converging on their former position. They had escaped with minutes to spare. Sarah Mitchell put the car in gear and drove away from Ashworth Manor without turning on the headlights, navigating the country roads with the skill of someone who had planned this route carefully. "Where are we going?" Victoria asked, still breathing heavily from their escape. "Somewhere they won't think to look for us," Sarah replied. "And somewhere we can figure out how to use what you've discovered to bring down the Heritage Foundation once and for all." As they drove through the storm-lashed countryside, Charles realized that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They were no longer just the inheritors of a family secret, they had become active participants in a war that had been raging in the shadows for over 20 years. The documents and evidence they carried represented the key to exposing one of the most powerful criminal conspiracies in modern British history. But their enemies had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear permanently. The real battle was just beginning. The safe house was nothing like what any of them had expected. Instead of a dingy warehouse or abandoned building, Sarah Mitchell had brought them to an elegant Georgian townhouse in a quiet residential area of Bath. The building appeared to be a private residence from the outside, but once inside, they discovered it was equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a fully operational command center. "Welcome to the headquarters of Phoenix Investigations," Sarah said as she led them into a spacious room lined with filing cabinets, computer monitors, and walls covered with photographs, documents, and connecting strings that resembled something from a detective thriller. "Your father wasn't my only client, and the Heritage Foundation isn't the only organization we've been investigating." Charles stood in the center of the room, slowly turning to take in the scope of what surrounded him. Photographs of dozens of individuals covered one wall, many of them faces he recognized from newspapers and television. Politicians, business leaders, judges, police commissioners, and media figures were all connected by colored strings that indicated various types of relationships and connections. "How long have you been doing this?" Marcus asked, examining a timeline that stretched across an entire wall and seemed to go back over 30 years. Sarah removed her jacket and revealed that she was younger than her voice had suggested over the phone, probably in her early 40s, with the lean build of someone who stayed in excellent physical condition. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her eyes held the sharp focus of someone accustomed to seeing patterns that others missed. "I started as a financial investigator for the Serious Fraud Office 12 years ago," she explained. "But I kept running into cases where my investigations were shut down or redirected by people higher up in the system. It took me several years to realize that the obstruction wasn't random, it was coordinated." Victoria had found a chair near one of the computer terminals and was staring at a screen displaying what appeared to be financial transfer records. "These numbers are staggering. Billions of pounds moving through dozens of different accounts and shell companies." "That's just the tip of the iceberg," Sarah replied. "The Heritage Foundation is what we call a node, one of several connected organizations that facilitate money laundering, political manipulation, and what they call social engineering on a massive scale." Mr. Pembridge had been remarkably quiet since their escape from the manor, but now he spoke up with a tremor in his voice. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been the Ashworth family solicitor for over 30 years. I thought I knew Edmund well, but it seems there was a great deal he never shared with me." "How exactly did he find you?" Sarah walked to a filing cabinet and retrieved a thick folder labeled E. Ashworth Client File. "Your father didn't find me, Mr. Pembridge. I found him. My investigation into the Heritage Foundation led me to conclude that Edmund was both a victim and a potential key witness. I approached him about 6 months ago with evidence that his life was in danger." She spread several photographs across a table in the center of the room. They showed Lord Edmund at various locations around London, apparently unaware that he was being followed and photographed. "These were taken by Heritage Foundation security personnel," Sarah explained. "Your father was under constant surveillance. They were documenting his movements, his contacts, his routines. When someone becomes that level of security risk to an organization like this, it usually means they're planning to eliminate the threat." Charles picked up one of the photographs that showed his father entering what appeared to be a medical building. "What's this location?" Harley Street Specialist Clinic, Sarah replied grimly. Your father was diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 months ago. He had maybe 6 months to live, which is why he finally decided to risk everything to expose the truth. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Lord Edmund's death hadn't been natural, but it also hadn't been a simple murder. The timing had been crucial to both sides. Marcus was studying the timeline on the wall, tracing connections between various events and individuals. Sarah, what exactly is the Heritage Foundation trying to accomplish? This looks like more than just financial crime. Sarah joined him at the timeline, pointing to various highlighted sections. On the surface, they present themselves as a charitable organization dedicated to preserving British cultural institutions. But their real purpose is social and political control. They identify individuals who pose threats to their members' interests, and they neutralize those threats through a variety of methods. She pointed to a section of the timeline labeled Target Acquisition and Neutralization. Sometimes it's financial pressure, they'll destroy someone's credit, manipulate their business relationships, or create scandals that ruin their reputation. Sometimes it's legal pressure, they have contacts in law enforcement and the judiciary who can initiate investigations or influence court proceedings. And, sometimes, when the threat is significant enough, they use more permanent solutions. Victoria looked up from the financial records she had been studying. How is this possible? How can a criminal organization operate at this level without being detected? Because they're not seen as criminals, Sarah explained. The Heritage Foundation is legally registered as a charitable organization. Its members are respected pillars of society. They attend charity galas, they donate to political campaigns, they sit on the boards of universities and hospitals. They've made themselves indispensable to the very institutions that should be investigating them. Charles found himself looking at a section of the wall dedicated to what appeared to be government connections. Are you saying they have people inside the government? Not just inside the government, Sarah replied. They have people who essentially are the government in many key areas. Look at this. She pulled down a chart that showed the current British cabinet, with several names highlighted in red. Next to each highlighted name were detailed financial records showing payments from Heritage Foundation subsidiaries. 5 current cabinet members, 12 members of parliament, 6 high court judges, and the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police have all received significant financial benefits from Heritage Foundation-connected organizations over the past 10 years. Mr. Pembridge had gone completely pale as he examined the evidence. This suggests that the entire British legal and political system has been compromised. Not the entire system, Sarah corrected. But enough key positions to ensure that any serious investigation into their activities can be blocked, redirected, or undermined before it gains traction. Marcus had moved to a computer terminal and was scrolling through what appeared to be surveillance reports. What about international connections? This can't just be a British operation. Sarah nodded grimly. The Heritage Foundation is part of a network of similar organizations operating in at least 12 countries. They share intelligence, coordinate activities, and support each other's operations when necessary. What you've uncovered at Ashworth Manor is evidence of just the British node of a much larger conspiracy. She pulled up a world map on one of the larger monitors, with highlighted areas showing the locations of connected organizations. The American node operates primarily through certain political action committees and charitable foundations. The French node works through cultural preservation societies. The German node focuses on historical research organizations. Each one appears legitimate on its own, but together they form a coordinated network capable of influencing events on a global scale. Charles was beginning to understand the true scope of what they had stumbled into. Evelyn Blackwood wasn't just investigating financial irregularities. She had discovered evidence of this entire network. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And the person feeding her information, the one codenamed Mockingbird, was someone high enough in the organization to have access to international coordination documents. Victoria looked up sharply. Do you know who Mockingbird was? Sarah hesitated, glancing around the room at each of them before answering. According to my investigation, Mockingbird was someone within the Heritage Foundation who had become disillusioned with their methods. Someone who had access to high-level communications and financial records. Someone who was in a position to document the organization's activities without being suspected. She paused, clearly reluctant to continue. Based on the evidence your father provided, and cross-referencing it with my own investigation, I believe Mockingbird was James Crawford, the banker who was present at that dinner party at your manor. Marcus looked shocked. Crawford was working against his own organization? It appears so. But the Heritage Foundation discovered his betrayal shortly before Evelyn's death. In fact, I believe Crawford's exposure as Mockingbird was what triggered the decision to eliminate Evelyn permanently rather than simply trying to discredit her investigation. Charles was studying a series of financial documents that showed regular payments from Crawford's bank to various accounts that had been linked to Evelyn's investigation. What happened to Crawford? Sarah pulled out a newspaper clipping from 18 months ago. The headline read, "Prominent banker dies in sailing accident." Crawford's yacht exploded during what was supposed to be a routine sailing trip off the coast of Scotland. The official investigation concluded it was a fuel system malfunction, but there were several factors that suggested otherwise. She spread out additional documents related to Crawford's death. First, Crawford was an experienced sailor who was fanatic about maintenance and safety. Second, his yacht had been serviced just 2 weeks before the accident, and the fuel system had been completely inspected. Third, there were traces of an accelerant found in the wreckage that were inconsistent with a normal fuel explosion. Mr. Pembridge was reading through the investigation report with growing alarm. This suggests that Crawford was murdered to prevent him from exposing the Heritage Foundation's activities. I believe Crawford's death was intended to send a message to anyone else who might be considering betraying the organization, Sarah said. But Crawford was smarter than they gave him credit for. Before his death, he had created multiple insurance policies, hidden caches of evidence that would be released if anything happened to him. Victoria leaned forward with interest. What kind of evidence? Sarah walked to a safe in the corner of the room and began entering a complex combination. Crawford documented everything. Financial transfers, meeting recordings, photographs of key figures, and, most importantly, the complete organizational structure of the international network. She opened the safe and retrieved several data storage devices and a thick folder of documents. This is Crawford's insurance policy. It includes evidence that would implicate over 200 individuals in criminal activities ranging from tax evasion to murder. But Crawford knew that simply releasing the information wouldn't be enough. The Heritage Foundation's influence in law enforcement and the media would allow them to suppress or discredit most revelations. Charles examined one of the storage devices. So what was Crawford's plan? Coordinated exposure, Sarah explained. Crawford identified journalists, law enforcement officials, and political figures in multiple countries who were outside the Heritage Foundation's influence. His plan was to simultaneously release evidence to all of them, making it impossible for the organization to contain the damage. Marcus was studying what appeared to be a timeline of planned revelations. But Crawford died before he could implement this plan. Yes, but he had established protocols for the evidence to be released posthumously if certain conditions were met. The problem is that those conditions required confirmation from multiple sources, including someone with access to the Heritage Foundation's current activities. Sarah looked directly at Charles. Your father was supposed to be that confirmation source. Crawford's evidence can only be released with verification from someone who has current, first-hand knowledge of the organization's operations. The implications of this statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They weren't just carrying evidence of past crimes, they were holding the key to exposing an ongoing criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power in multiple countries. But they were also carrying a target that would bring the full weight of the Heritage Foundation's resources down upon them. How much time do we have? Charles asked quietly. Sarah checked her watch and looked at several monitors displaying what appeared to be security feeds from around the property. Crawford's posthumous protocols included a dead man switch. If the verification isn't provided within 72 hours of certain trigger events, the evidence will be released automatically to prevent it from being suppressed permanently. She looked around the room grimly. Your father's death was one of those trigger events. The 72-hour countdown started when his death certificate was filed. That gives us approximately 18 hours to verify the evidence and coordinate its release properly, or Crawford's information will be dumped onto the internet without context or protection for the people trying to investigate it. Victoria stood up abruptly. 18 hours? That's not enough time to. She was interrupted by an alarm that began sounding throughout the safe house. Sarah immediately moved to the security monitors, her expression growing increasingly tense as she watched feeds from cameras positioned around the property. They found us, she said quietly. We have company. On the monitors, they could see vehicles positioning themselves around the building. Unlike the amateur surveillance at Ashworth Manor, this was clearly a professional operation involving multiple teams and sophisticated equipment. Charles counted at least 12 people in tactical gear taking positions around the townhouse. How is this possible? Marcus demanded. How could they have tracked us here? Sarah was already moving toward what appeared to be an emergency equipment locker. They didn't track us. They've been watching this location for months, waiting for the right moment to move. Your father's death and the discovery of the vault gave them the justification they needed to take direct action. She handed each of them a small communication device and what appeared to be a GPS tracking unit. There's an emergency exit through the basement that leads to the underground parking garage of the building next door. From there, you can reach the train station without being detected. Victoria clutched her tracking device nervously. What about you? Sarah was checking the chamber of a pistol with practiced efficiency. Someone needs to buy you time to escape and ensure that Crawford's evidence makes it to the right people. I've been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Charles grabbed her arm. There has to be another way. We can all get out of here together. No, Sarah said firmly. The Heritage Foundation has been eliminating loose ends for over 20 years. If they capture all of us together, Crawford's evidence dies with us, and Evelyn Blackwood's murder will never be solved. She handed Charles a secure phone and a data storage device. This contains everything you need to verify Crawford's evidence and coordinate its release. There's a contact list of journalists and law enforcement officials in multiple countries who are outside the Heritage Foundation's influence. You have 16 hours to make contact and provide verification. The sound of breaking glass came from somewhere on the ground floor of the townhouse. Go, Sarah commanded. Now. As they made their way toward the basement exit, Charles looked back to see Sarah positioning herself at one of the computer terminals, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she initiated what appeared to be a data deletion protocol. The last thing they heard as they descended into the basement was the sound of gunfire erupting from the floor above. They had escaped again, but Charles knew that their enemies were closing in. The Heritage Foundation was no longer content to work from the shadows. The war had begun in earnest. The emergency tunnel beneath the Bath safe house led them through a maze of Victorian-era service passages that connected several buildings in the historic district. Charles led the way using the small flashlight Sarah had given them, while Marcus helped support Mr. Pembridge, whose age was beginning to show after their second traumatic escape in less than 12 hours. Victoria had surprised them all by adapting quickly to their circumstances. She had discarded her high heels in favor of emergency boots from Sarah's equipment locker, and she carried the precious data storage devices with the focused determination of someone who finally understood what was at stake. The underground passage ended at a concealed door behind the wine cellar of what appeared to be a small hotel. Charles checked his watch as they emerged into the building's service area. They had 14 hours remaining before Crawford's dead man switch would trigger the automatic release of evidence. We need to find somewhere with secure internet access, Charles said, consulting the list of contacts Sarah had given them. And we need to do it without being tracked. Mr. Pembridge, despite his exhaustion, had been thinking strategically about their situation. I have a suggestion. My late wife's sister runs a small legal practice about 20 miles from here. She specializes in international law, and her office would have the kind of secure communication systems we need. Marcus looked skeptical. Can we trust her? Eleanor has never had any connection to the Heritage Foundation or its members, Pembridge replied. She spent her career fighting against exactly the kind of corruption we're trying to expose. If anyone can help us coordinate with international law enforcement, it's her. They made their way carefully through the early morning streets of Bath, using public transportation and staying alert for any signs of surveillance. The storm had passed, but grey clouds still dominated the sky, creating an atmosphere that matched their grim situation. Eleanor Pembridge operated her law firm from a converted Georgian house in a small market town that seemed far removed from the world of international conspiracies and criminal networks. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to identifying lies and deception. Her reaction to their story and the evidence they presented was immediate and decisive. "My God," she whispered as she examined Crawford's financial records on her secure computer system. "I've been working on cases involving offshore money laundering for years, but I never imagined anything on this scale." Charles watched nervously as Eleanor's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing legal databases and international law enforcement networks. "Can you help us coordinate the evidence release?" "More than that," Eleanor replied grimly. "I can tell you that several of the jurisdictions affected by this conspiracy have been building their own cases against Heritage Foundation members. What you've brought me isn't just evidence of new crimes, it's the missing pieces that will make existing investigations prosecutable." She pulled up a secure communication channel that connected her directly to law enforcement agencies in 6 different countries. "I've been working with a task force that includes investigators from the FBI, Interpol, the Serious Fraud Office, and several European agencies. They've been tracking Heritage Foundation activities for 3 years, but they've never had access to the internal documents and financial records that would prove coordination between the national nodes." Victoria looked up from another computer where she had been examining what appeared to be meeting transcripts. "Eleanor, these documents show that the Heritage Foundation has been planning something called Operation Cleanslate. It's scheduled to begin in less than a week." Eleanor immediately focused on the transcripts Victoria had found. As she read, her expression grew increasingly alarmed. "This isn't just about covering up past crimes," she said quietly. "They're planning to eliminate everyone who has been investigating them, along with their family members and associates." Marcus joined them at the computer screen. "What kind of elimination?" "According to this timeline, they're going to stage a series of what will appear to be terrorist attacks targeting specific individuals. The attacks will be blamed on international criminals seeking revenge against law enforcement officials and journalists who have interfered with their operations." Charles felt his blood run cold as he read the detailed plans. Over 40 names were listed as targets, including Sarah Mitchell, Eleanor herself, and several journalists who had written articles critical of Heritage Foundation members. "When does this start?" he asked. Eleanor checked the timestamp on the documents. "According to this schedule, the first phase begins tomorrow morning with coordinated attacks in London, Paris, and Berlin." The room fell silent as they absorbed the implications. The Heritage Foundation wasn't just trying to cover up their past crimes, they were preparing to go to war against anyone who threatened their operations. "Mr. Pembridge spoke up with a tremor in his voice. "Eleanor, we have to warn these people immediately." "I'm already on it," Eleanor replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she initiated emergency communications with law enforcement agencies across Europe. "But warning the targets isn't enough. We need to stop the attacks before they happen, and that means we need to provide law enforcement with enough evidence to justify immediate arrests of Heritage Foundation leadership." Charles consulted the contact list Sarah had given him. "What about the journalists on Crawford's list?" "If we can coordinate simultaneous publication of the evidence across multiple countries, it will be much harder for the Heritage Foundation to suppress the story." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Excellent thinking. But we need to be very careful about timing. If we release the evidence too early, the Heritage Foundation will have time to implement emergency protocols to protect their leadership. If we wait too long, Operation Cleanslate will proceed as planned." Victoria had been studying what appeared to be organizational charts showing the Heritage Foundation's command structure. According to these documents, the operation can only be authorized by unanimous vote of something called the Inner Circle. If we can prove that the inner circle is meeting to authorize these attacks, law enforcement can arrest them all at once.
Eleanor pulled up a calendar on her computer. When is their next inner circle meeting? Marcus found the relevant information in Crawford's notes. Tomorrow night in London. The meeting is scheduled for 8 p.m. at a private club in Belgravia.
Perfect, Eleanor said with grim satisfaction. That gives us time to coordinate with law enforcement agencies and ensure they're in position to make arrests during the meeting itself. But Charles had noticed something troubling in the organizational documents.
Eleanor, look at this list of inner circle members.
3 of them are currently government ministers, and 1 is a senior judge. If we try to coordinate through normal law enforcement channels, the Heritage Foundation will be warned before any arrests can be made. Eleanor studied the list carefully, her expression growing more concerned as she recognized the names.
You're right. We need to bypass normal channels entirely. But I know someone who can help.
She picked up a secure phone and dialed a number from memory. After a brief conversation conducted in what sounded like code phrases, she hung up and turned back to the group. I've just contacted Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Walsh of Scotland Yard. She's been investigating Heritage Foundation activities independently, outside normal channels, because she suspected there were leaks in her department. She's agreed to meet with us in 2 hours at a secure location. Mr. Pembridge looked relieved for the first time since they had discovered the vault. Patricia Walsh has an excellent reputation. If anyone can coordinate arrests of this magnitude without alerting the targets, it's her. But their relief was short-lived. Eleanor's secure communication system suddenly displayed an urgent alert message.
What is it?
Charles asked.
Eleanor's face had gone pale as she read the message. It's from one of my contacts at Interpol. Sarah Mitchell was found dead in the Bath safe house 3 hours ago.
The room fell silent. Sarah had bought them time to escape, but she had paid the ultimate price. Victoria wiped tears from her eyes.
How many more people are going to die because of this?
That depends on what we do in the next 10 hours, Eleanor replied grimly.
Sarah's death means the Heritage Foundation knows we escaped with Crawford's evidence. They'll be accelerating their timeline.
As if to emphasize her point, Eleanor's communication system displayed another urgent message. 2 of the journalists on Crawford's contact list have been found dead in their homes this morning.
Both deaths are being investigated as apparent suicides, but the timing suggests otherwise.
Charles realized they were running out of time faster than they had anticipated. We need to make contact with the remaining journalists immediately and coordinate publication of the evidence before more of them are eliminated. Eleanor was already initiating secure communications with journalists in 5 countries. I'm sending encrypted packages of evidence to everyone on Crawford's list simultaneously. Even if some of them are compromised or eliminated, enough will survive to ensure the story gets published. Marcus had been studying the Operation Cleanslate documents more carefully.
There's something else we need to consider.
According to these plans, the Heritage Foundation has contingency protocols in place in case their activities are exposed.
What kind of contingencies? Victoria asked.
Marcus pointed to a section of the documents labeled Scorched Earth Protocols. If they can't prevent exposure of their activities, they're prepared to eliminate all evidence and witnesses, including their own lower-level members who could testify against the leadership.
Eleanor looked up from her communication systems. How many people are we talking about?
According to these lists, over 300 individuals across 12 countries know enough about Heritage Foundation activities to be considered security risks. The magnitude of what they were dealing with was becoming clear. The Heritage Foundation wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a network that had infiltrated governments, law enforcement, and media organizations across the Western world.
Exposing them would require a coordinated international effort unprecedented in the history of law enforcement.
But they were running out of time, and their enemies were eliminating potential witnesses faster than they could be protected. Charles checked his watch. They had 9 hours before Crawford's dead man switch would trigger automatic release of evidence.
9 hours to coordinate arrests across multiple countries.
9 hours to prevent a series of terrorist attacks designed to eliminate dozens of investigators and journalists. And 9 hours to stay alive long enough to see justice done. Eleanor finished transmitting evidence packages to journalists and turned to her computer to coordinate with law enforcement agencies.
DCI Walsh will be here in 30 minutes, she announced. We need to have a complete operational plan ready for her review.
But, as they began organizing their strategy, Charles noticed something that made his stomach drop. The secure communication system was showing incoming connection attempts from unrecognized sources.
Eleanor, he said quietly, I think we may have a problem. On the screen, they could see that someone was trying to hack into Eleanor's secure systems. The attempts were sophisticated and persistent, suggesting professional cyber capabilities. They've found us again, Victoria whispered. Eleanor immediately began implementing emergency security protocols, but Charles could see that their pursuers were systematically breaking through each layer of protection. How much time do we have? Marcus asked. Eleanor checked her security monitors.
Based on the speed of their penetration attempts, maybe 20 minutes before they break through completely.
Charles made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. We're not running this time, he said firmly. We're going to finish this here and now. He picked up the secure phone and began dialing numbers from Crawford's journalist contact list. If the Heritage Foundation wants to stop us, they're going to have to do it while the whole world is watching. The final confrontation was about to begin. Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Walsh arrived at Eleanor's law office with a tactical team that had been carefully selected for their lack of connection to Heritage Foundation members. She was a woman in her early 50s with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent decades fighting corruption at the highest levels of British society. Her reaction to the evidence was immediate and decisive. This changes everything, she said as she reviewed Crawford's documents on Eleanor's secure computer system. We've been investigating Heritage Foundation activities for 3 years, but we've never had access to their internal communications and financial records. Charles watched nervously as Walsh's team set up additional security measures around the building. Outside, they could see unmarked vehicles taking positions throughout the area. Inspector, how many of your people can you trust completely? Eleanor asked. Walsh consulted a list on her secure tablet. I've brought 12 officers who have been vetted independently. Beyond that, I can't guarantee that information won't leak to Heritage Foundation contacts within the police service. Marcus had been monitoring news feeds on multiple computers, watching for any signs that their enemies were aware of the coordination taking place. The Heritage Foundation has been unusually quiet for the past 6 hours. No public statements, no media appearances by any of their known members. That's not a good sign, Walsh replied grimly. When an organization this sophisticated goes silent, it usually means they're preparing for decisive action. Victoria looked up from another computer where she had been tracking international law enforcement communications. Inspector, I'm seeing reports of unusual activity in several major cities. Large numbers of people with diplomatic passports arriving simultaneously in London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington. Walsh immediately contacted her international counterparts to verify these reports. What she learned confirmed their worst fears. Heritage Foundation leadership is converging on their national headquarters in 4 countries simultaneously, she announced. This isn't just about stopping our investigation, they're implementing a complete reorganization of their operations. Eleanor had been studying the most recent communications intercepted from Heritage Foundation secure channels. According to these messages, they're not planning to simply eliminate the current targets of Operation Cleanslate. They're preparing to activate sleeper assets embedded in government and law enforcement agencies across the Western world. The scope of what they were dealing with became clear as Eleanor displayed organizational charts showing Heritage Foundation members in key positions throughout multiple governments. This is essentially a soft coup, she explained. If they can eliminate the people investigating them while simultaneously activating their embedded assets, they can reshape the political and economic landscape of entire countries. Charles realized they were facing something far more dangerous than a criminal conspiracy. The Heritage Foundation had spent decades positioning itself to take control of democratic institutions from within. How do we stop something this massive? He asked.
Walsh was already coordinating with her international counterparts through secure channels.
"We've got one advantage: they don't know we have Crawford's complete organizational charts and communication protocols. If we can coordinate simultaneous arrests of their leadership in all 4 countries, we can disrupt their command structure before they can implement their larger plan." But Marcus had discovered something troubling in the latest intercepts from Heritage Foundation communications. "Inspector, they know we're here. These messages reference the Ashworth problem and indicate that they have assets en route to this location." Walsh immediately contacted her tactical team positioned around the building. The news was not encouraging. "We've got multiple vehicles approaching from different directions," she announced after completing her radio check. "Professional surveillance teams, and what appears to be at least 2 tactical units."
Eleanor began implementing emergency data transmission protocols, uploading copies of all their evidence to secure servers in multiple countries simultaneously. "If they take this location, the evidence will still be available to international investigators," she explained. "But we need to ensure that the coordinated arrests happen regardless of what occurs here." Charles made a decision that would determine the outcome of everything they had worked toward.
"Inspector Walsh, how long do you need to coordinate the international arrests?" "4 hours minimum," Walsh replied. "The logistics of synchronizing operations across 4 countries while maintaining operational security is extraordinarily complex." Charles checked his watch. They had 5 hours before Crawford's dead man switch would trigger automatic evidence release, but Heritage Foundation tactical teams were already surrounding their position. "Then, we need to buy you 4 hours," he said. Victoria looked at him in alarm. "Charles, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the Heritage Foundation has spent 20 years operating in the shadows because they've never had to face public scrutiny." "But what if we change that?" He picked up Eleanor's secure phone and began dialing the number for the BBC newsroom. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked. "I'm calling a press conference," Charles replied. "Right here, right now, with cameras rolling while Heritage Foundation operatives are trying to kill us." Eleanor understood immediately. "Brilliant. If this is happening live on international television, they can't simply eliminate us and cover it up." Within 30 minutes, news crews from major international media organizations were arriving at Eleanor's law office. Charles had used his family's social prominence and the sensational nature of their story to ensure maximum coverage. As cameras were being set up in Eleanor's conference room, Walsh received confirmation that Heritage Foundation tactical teams had taken positions around the building but were maintaining their distance from the media vehicles. "They're stuck," Walsh observed with satisfaction. "They can't attack while international media is present, but they can't leave without risking exposure of their operations." The press conference began at exactly 2 p.m. London time, with live feeds going to news organizations in 23 countries. Charles had decided to tell the complete story, beginning with their father's confession and ending with the evidence of Heritage Foundation plans for Operation Cleanslate. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within an hour, government officials in 4 countries were calling for emergency parliamentary sessions to address the allegations. Police departments that had been compromised by Heritage Foundation infiltration found themselves under investigation by external agencies. But, most importantly, the public exposure had forced the Heritage Foundation to abort Operation Cleanslate before it could be implemented. Victoria read from a laptop displaying news feeds from around the world. Heritage Foundation members are being arrested simultaneously in London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington. The coordination is working perfectly. Marcus had been monitoring Heritage Foundation communication channels, which had gone completely silent once the arrests began. "Their command structure is collapsing," he reported. "Without central coordination, their embedded assets are remaining inactive rather than risking exposure." Mr. Pembridge, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire crisis, made an observation that proved to be the most important of the day. "The Heritage Foundation's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness," he said. "Their insistence on centralized control meant that disrupting their leadership paralyzed their entire network." By evening, over 200 Heritage Foundation members had been arrested across 4 countries.
The evidence provided by Crawford's files and, supplemented by the Ashworth vault documents, had resulted in charges ranging from conspiracy to murder. But Charles knew the story wasn't over. As the media circus around Eleanor's law office began to wind down, DCI Walsh approached him with news that would reshape everything they thought they understood about their father's role in the conspiracy. "Mr. Ashworth, we've completed our preliminary analysis of your father's private papers.
There's something you need to know."
Walsh handed him a document that had been found in Edmund's personal safe, separate from the vault materials. "Your father wasn't just a victim of Heritage Foundation manipulation. For the past 5 years, he was working as an undercover asset for MI5, gathering evidence against the organization from within." The document was an official MI5 authorization signed by Edmund and his handler, outlining his mission to infiltrate and document Heritage Foundation activities. "He couldn't tell you about his real role because it would have compromised the investigation and put your family at risk," Walsh explained. "But his work provided crucial intelligence that made today's arrests possible." Charles read through the authorization document, finally understanding the full complexity of his father's position. Edmund's confession about killing Evelyn Blackwood was designed to provide you with a credible reason to investigate the Heritage Foundation after his death, Walsh continued. "He knew that you would eventually discover the evidence he had been gathering, but he needed a story that would motivate you to act quickly and decisively." Victoria looked confused.
"Are you saying that father didn't actually kill Evelyn?"
Walsh shook her head. "According to our investigation, Evelyn Blackwood was murdered by Heritage Foundation operatives on Sir Reginald Thornby's direct orders. Your father discovered her body and was blackmailed into helping dispose of it, but he didn't cause her death." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Walsh showed them surveillance footage that had been recovered from a Heritage Foundation safe house in London. "This video was recorded the night of Evelyn's death," she explained.
The footage clearly showed Thornby and 2 other men following Evelyn into the hotel garden.
What happened next confirmed Edmund's account. Evelyn was deliberately pushed against the stone balustrade, and her death was anything but accidental. Marcus watched the footage with a mixture of relief and anger. Father spent 20 years believing he was a murderer when he was actually helping to gather evidence against the real killers. The psychological torture he endured was deliberate, Walsh explained. The Heritage Foundation wanted to ensure his complete cooperation by making him believe he was equally guilty of their crimes. As the sun set over the small market town where they had made their stand against one of the most powerful criminal organizations in modern history, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had started by believing they were simply settling their father's estate and had discovered instead that they were inheriting a legacy of courage and sacrifice that stretched back years. Eleanor was coordinating with international prosecutors to ensure that the evidence would be properly presented in court proceedings that would likely continue for years. The Heritage Foundation network is broken, but dismantling it completely will require continued vigilance, she warned. Organizations like this don't disappear overnight, they adapt and evolve. But Charles was no longer the frightened man who had sat in the library of Ashworth Manor just 48 hours earlier. The experience of fighting for truth against seemingly impossible odds had transformed him, just as it had transformed his brother and stepmother. Victoria had announced her intention to establish a foundation in Edmund's memory that would support investigative journalists and whistleblowers who risked their lives exposing corruption. Marcus had decided to return to England permanently to help oversee the complex legal proceedings that would result from their discoveries. And Charles had accepted an invitation from several international law enforcement agencies to serve as a consultant on investigations into similar networks operating in other parts of the world. The Heritage Foundation's reign of terror was over, but the work of ensuring that such organizations could never again threaten democratic institutions was just beginning. As they prepared to leave Eleanor's law office under police escort, Charles took one last look at the evidence that had brought down one of history's most sophisticated criminal conspiracies. 20 years after Evelyn Blackwood's death, justice had finally been served. But, more importantly, the truth had proven more powerful than any conspiracy, no matter how well-funded or deeply entrenched. The Ashworth legacy would be remembered not for the crimes committed in its name, but for the courage it took to expose those crimes and ensure they could never be repeated. The vault had been opened, the secrets revealed, and the truth set free. And, in the end, that had made all the difference.